The coral sand tears at his bare feet as he runs. Private Tanaka. Let's call him that, though his name could be any of the thousands who experienced this nightmare, scrambles through the shattered palm grove on Saipan, July 1944. The air itself seems to scream. American artillery shells shriek overhead before detonating in geysers of earth and fire. The acrid smoke burns his throat. His Type 38 rifle is gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the American advance that has crushed his regiment in less than 3 weeks. Around him, his comrades are making their final choices. Some charge directly into American machine gun fire, their last banzai cry cut short by a wall of lead. Others clutch grenades to their chests, choosing the Emperor's embrace over surrender. Tanaka's mind races through years of conditioning. From the moment he entered military service, the message was absolute. Capture means torture, humiliation, death. The Americans are white devils, barbaric monsters who will desecrate his body and dishonor his family. His instructors showed him photographs, propaganda images of mutilated prisoners. His officers recited the code. Death is lighter than a feather, but duty is heavier than a mountain. To surrender is to cease being Japanese. It is to become less than human. His family will be informed he died honorably. If they learn he surrendered, his name will be struck from the family register. His mother will mourn a son who was never born. But Tanaka's body betrays him. He is starving, the supply lines cut weeks ago. He is wounded. Shrapnel has torn through his left calf, leaving him unable to run. And somewhere beneath the layers of military indoctrination, some animal instinct for survival makes his hands tremble as he considers pulling the pin on his last grenade. The American voices grow closer, speaking that harsh, incomprehensible language. He closes his eyes. This is the end. He has failed his emperor, his family, his nation. When those white devils find him, the real hell will begin. 3 months later. November 23, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow falls gently on a landscape so foreign to Tanaka that it might as well be another planet. The cold penetrates everything, the thin barracks walls, his issued-wool clothing, the very air he breathes. He stands in a line with hundreds of other Japanese prisoners, all of them sharing the same hollow-eyed confusion. They have not been tortured. They have not been executed. Instead, they have been fed, given medical care, and housed in heated buildings. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Everything they were taught was a lie, yet they cannot fully accept this new reality. Many prisoners still refuse to eat, convinced the food is poisoned. Some have attempted suicide in the first weeks, unable to bear the shame of continued existence. But today is different. Today, the Americans are doing something inexplicable. An American officer, accompanied by one of those Nisei interpreters whom the prisoners view with a mixture of confusion and contempt, explains that today is Thanksgiving, an American holiday of gratitude and abundance. The prisoners do not understand. Then the food arrives. Tanaka stares at the tray placed before him. His mind struggles to process what he sees. Roasted turkey, the meat so tender it falls from the bone. Mashed potatoes swimming in rich gravy. Candied sweet potatoes glistening with butter and sugar. Cranberry sauce. Fresh bread still warm. Green beans. Pumpkin pie topped with real cream. The portions are enormous. More food on this single tray than he would have received in a week as a soldier of the Imperial Army. The aroma overwhelms him. His stomach, shrunken from months of near starvation, cramps with hunger and confusion. Around him, other prisoners react with visible shock. Some weep openly. Others refuse to touch the food, paralyzed by the suspicion that this is an elaborate form of torture, that they will be punished for eating, or that the food itself is a trap. But slowly, hesitantly, they begin to eat. And the food is real. It is abundant. It is better than anything most of these men have ever tasted. Tanaka takes a bite of turkey, and something inside him cracks. This was the enemy, a man trained to die hating America. So why, on a cold winter day in 1944, was the United States Army serving him a feast? This wasn't an act of random charity. This was a calculated act of war. The question is, why? To understand what happened at Camp McCoy, we must first understand the mind of the Imperial Japanese soldier, a psychological profile so foreign to Western military thinking that American commanders initially struggled to comprehend it at all. The foundation was Bushido, the ancient warrior code adapted and weaponized by Japan's militarist government in the 1930s. But this wasn't the historical Bushido of the samurai class. This was a modern, totalitarian interpretation designed to create soldiers who viewed death as not just acceptable, but preferable to the dishonor of surrender. From the moment a man entered military service, he underwent systematic conditioning. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882 and required to be memorized by all service members, stated explicitly, "Duty is heavier than a mountain, death is lighter than a feather." This wasn't metaphor, it was operational doctrine. Military training reinforced this programming through ritualized brutality. Senior soldiers routinely beat junior soldiers as a form of spiritual training. The message was clear: suffering purifies, weakness is contemptible, and mercy is a foreign concept. Soldiers were taught that death in battle guaranteed them a place at Yasukuni Shrine, where their spirits would be honored as kami, divine beings. Surrender, by contrast, meant spiritual annihilation. A captured soldier's name would be struck from family records. Memorial services would be held as if he had died. In the eyes of the state, the family, and the soldier himself, surrender meant ceasing to exist. The propaganda intensified this conditioning. Soldiers were shown photographs and films depicting alleged American atrocities, mutilated corpses, tortured prisoners. They were told that American soldiers collected Japanese skulls as trophies, that they would be castrated, blinded, and left to die in agony if captured. Whether these specific claims were true or fabricated mattered less than their psychological impact. They created a terror of capture so profound that death seemed merciful by comparison. This created an unprecedented challenge for American forces. By 1944, as U.S. forces advanced across the Pacific, they were taking prisoners in growing numbers. But these weren't ordinary POWs. These were men who had been conditioned to believe that their very existence as prisoners was a form of living death. The suicide rate in early American POW camps was alarming. Prisoners organized resistance cells, attacked guards, and engaged in mass hunger strikes. At Camp Cowra in Australia in August 1944, over 1,000 Japanese POWs launched a coordinated breakout attempt, with hundreds choosing to die rather than be recaptured. 4 Australian guards were killed, and 234 Japanese prisoners died in the breakout and subsequent manhunt, many by suicide. American military planners faced a dilemma. By war's end, they would hold over 40,000 Japanese prisoners across camps in the United States, Hawaii, the Philippines, and other Pacific territories. These men represented a potential security nightmare. They were disciplined, organized, and indoctrinated to resist. Traditional POW management, simply holding prisoners securely until war's end, risked constant uprisings, mass suicides, and the diversion of thousands of American troops needed as guards. But some American strategists saw something else, an opportunity. The key insight came from an unlikely source, the Nisei interpreters. These were second-generation Japanese Americans, many of whom had been recruited from internment camps where their own families were unjustly imprisoned. Despite this profound injustice, thousands volunteered for military service, many joining the Military Intelligence Service as translators and interrogators. They would become crucial to understanding the psychological profile of Japanese prisoners. The relationship between Nisei interpreters and Japanese POWs was fraught with tension. To the prisoners, the Nisei represented something incomprehensible: ethnic Japanese who had chosen America over the emperor. In the binary worldview of imperial Japanese ideology, this was impossible. The Nisei must be traitors, race traitors of the worst kind. Early interrogation reports document prisoners who refused to speak to Nisei interpreters, who spat at them, who viewed them with greater hatred than they felt for white American soldiers. Yet it was precisely this cultural bridge that made the Nisei invaluable. They could detect the subtle signs of psychological shift in prisoners. They could distinguish between genuine fanaticism and performative loyalty maintained out of fear of fellow prisoners. And they could communicate in ways that white American officers never could, not just through language, but through cultural context and nuance. Working closely with the Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch, Nisei interpreters helped American commanders understand a crucial insight. The ideological conditioning of Japanese soldiers, while profound, was also brittle. It was based on a foundation of lies. Lies about American barbarism, lies about the impossibility of honorable life after surrender, lies about the superiority of the Japanese military system. If those lies could be systematically dismantled, the entire psychological structure might collapse. This understanding led to a radical proposal. What if American POW camps didn't just hold Japanese prisoners? What if they re-educated them? What if the camps themselves became weapons in an ideological war, designed to demonstrate the fundamental superiority of the American system not through propaganda, but through lived experience? What if kindness, genuine, overwhelming, undeniable kindness, could be weaponized? The strategy was codified in classified directives from the Psychological Warfare Branch. Japanese prisoners would be treated not merely according to the Geneva Conventions, but far beyond them. They would be shown an abundance so extreme, so undeniable, that it would force a fundamental reevaluation of everything they had been taught about America and about their own nation's cause. The operation had a simple premise. You can't argue with a full stomach. The numbers tell a story that propaganda never could. A standard daily ration for an Imperial Japanese soldier in the field contained approximately 2,000 to 2,200 calories, when supply lines functioned properly. By 1944, with American submarines strangling Japanese shipping lanes, many frontline units received far less. Soldiers subsisted on a few handfuls of rice, perhaps some pickled vegetables, occasionally a bit of fish or tinned meat. Hunger was a constant companion for Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theater. The Thanksgiving meal served at Camp McCoy and other American POW camps in November 1944 contained between 3,500 and 4,000 calories. In a single meal. Let's break down what Private Tanaka and his fellow prisoners actually received that November day. The turkey alone, each prisoner received approximately 12 to 14 ounces of roasted meat, represented more protein than many had consumed in a week of military service. The mashed potatoes, prepared with real milk and butter, came in portions exceeding a full pound. The candied sweet potatoes, glistening with brown sugar and butter, represented a luxury most prisoners had never experienced even in civilian life. Fresh bread, cranberry sauce, green beans prepared with bacon fat, and pumpkin pie made with real cream and sugar. But the sheer quantity of food was only part of the psychological impact. It was the quality, the undeniable evidence of abundance, that proved devastating to Japanese militarist ideology. Consider the logistics. The United States was fighting a two-front war across two oceans, supplying millions of troops on 6 continents, and yet it could afford to serve an elaborate holiday feast to enemy prisoners. The meal wasn't scraped together from scraps or presented as a rare exception. It was one of many such feasts. Christmas would bring another, even more elaborate. Regular daily rations in American POW camps exceeded 3,000 calories and included meat, fresh vegetables, bread, real coffee, and desserts. The Nisei interpreter's reports from that first Thanksgiving dinner capture reactions that ranged from disbelief to emotional collapse. Some prisoners wept openly. Others ate in stunned silence. A few refused the food entirely, convinced it must be poisoned or a trap. But those who ate, and eventually nearly all did, experienced what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. They had been taught that America was weak, decadent, on the brink of collapse. They had been told that Japan's sacred mission was to save Asia from Western deprivation and imperialism. Yet here was irrefutable evidence that contradicted everything. If America could feed its prisoners, the enemy, with such abundance, what did that say about comparative national power? If this was how America treated men who had fought to kill American soldiers, what did that say about the supposed barbarism of Western civilization? One prisoner, in a statement recorded by interpreters, said, "We were told you were devils, but devils do not do this." Another, "I feel great shame. My country could never do this for its own soldiers, yet you do it for us. We have been fighting for the wrong side." But the Thanksgiving feast was just the opening move. The psychological warfare branch had designed a comprehensive program of systematic ideological dismantlement. Prisoners were paid for work details, 80 cents per day, a wage that seemed astronomical to men who had served for minimal or no pay in the Imperial Army. This money could be spent in camp canteens that stocked items most prisoners had never seen. Hershey bars, Coca-Cola, American cigarettes, toiletries, writing materials, even musical instruments and sports equipment. The canteens weren't elaborate. They were simply standard American military post exchanges. But to prisoners from a nation where rationing had been severe since the 1930s, they represented a material abundance that bordered on the surreal. The camps had movie nights showing American films. They had baseball diamonds and volleyball courts. They had libraries. Prisoners could write letters home, censored, but delivered. They received medical and dental care that exceeded what most had received as active-duty soldiers. Dentists filled cavities. Doctors treated chronic conditions. Surgeons performed operations that saved lives and restored function. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Livingston in Louisiana, and dozens of other facilities, the routine was similar. Demonstrate through daily life that everything the prisoners had been taught about America was false. Don't argue with them, show them. Don't debate ideology. Undermine it through undeniable material reality. The data compiled by the Psychological Warfare Branch tracked the psychological impact with clinical precision. In the first weeks of captivity, approximately 60 to 70% of prisoners refused to cooperate beyond the minimum required by the Geneva Conventions. They gave only name, rank, and serial number. They maintained elaborate rituals of loyalty to the emperor. They organized resistance cells that punished prisoners who cooperated with Americans or who expressed doubts about imperial ideology. By 6 months, those numbers had shifted dramatically. Over 40% of prisoners were classified as cooperative or converted, men who had openly renounced imperial militarism and expressed support for democratic principles. Another 30 to 40% were classified as neutral, men who maintained outward loyalty to the emperor but no longer actively resisted American authority and showed signs of ideological doubt. Only 20 to 30% remained hardcore, fanatically loyal and resistant to any change in ideology. The abundance wasn't random or accidental. It was calculated to the calorie. The Psychological Warfare Branch understood that ideology is not just a matter of belief, but of material conditions. Humans are not purely rational actors. We are embodied beings whose convictions are shaped by physical experience. A man whose belly is full, whose body is healthy, whose material needs are met, is a man whose mind is open to reconsidering his assumptions about the world. The Japanese prisoners had been conditioned to believe that the imperial system, for all its harshness, was necessary and righteous. They had been told that Western democracy led to weakness, chaos, and degeneracy. Yet here they were, living better as prisoners of democracy than they had as soldiers of the emperor. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. And the Americans didn't stop at food. They went after the cultural heart of Japanese militarism. The camps established programs to teach prisoners about American government, economics, and history. Classes were voluntary, but well attended. Nisei instructors presented material carefully designed to avoid direct attacks on the emperor, a line that, if crossed, would trigger defensive resistance. Instead, the classes focused on comparative systems, how democratic governance worked, how market economies functioned, how American constitutional principles protected individual rights. The goal wasn't to force conversion, but to plant seeds of doubt and to provide an alternative framework for understanding the world. Perhaps most surprisingly, the camps allowed, even encouraged, Japanese cultural activities. Prisoners could practice traditional arts, hold religious ceremonies, celebrate Japanese holidays. This wasn't mere humanitarian kindness, it was strategic. By permitting Japanese cultural expression, the Americans demonstrated that democracy didn't require cultural annihilation. A man could be Japanese and embrace democratic principles. The two weren't mutually exclusive, a message that directly contradicted imperial propaganda, which insisted that Western democracy was fundamentally incompatible with Japanese culture and spirit. The abundance, the education, the cultural respect. All of it was designed to create what intelligence officers called prosperity trauma. The prisoners were experiencing better treatment as enemies than they had as loyal soldiers. This created a psychological crisis that forced deep reevaluation. Some prisoners experienced this as a form of emotional breakdown, weeping, depression, existential despair at the realization that they had fought and their comrades had died for a system built on lies. Others experienced it as liberation, a gradual awakening to new possibilities for understanding their own identity and their nation's future. But not everyone embraced this transformation. Within the camps, a shadow war was being fought, and it would explode into violence during the Christmas season of 1944. In every American POW camp holding Japanese prisoners, the same dynamic emerged: a split between those who were beginning to question imperial ideology and those who viewed such questioning as treason demanding punishment. The hardcore prisoners, approximately 20 to 30% of the population at most camps by late 1944, organized themselves into secret resistance cells. These men were typically officers and senior NCOs who had the most invested in the imperial system. They had internalized Bushido more completely, and for them, acceptance of American kindness represented a spiritual death more terrible than physical execution. They saw the abundance, the medical care, the education programs, not as genuine humanitarian treatment, but as an insidious psychological poison designed to corrupt and weaken Japanese spirit. They weren't entirely wrong. It was psychological warfare. But their response was to wage their own war within the camps. Documented reports from Camp McCoy, Camp Clarinda, and other facilities reveal the tactics of these resistance cells. They conducted kangaroo courts, trying prisoners accused of cooperation with Americans. Punishments ranged from social ostracism to physical beatings. Attacks disguised as accidents or conducted in the blind spots of American surveillance. Prisoners who attended education classes or who spoke positively about American treatment were threatened, intimidated, or assaulted. Some hardcore prisoners organized hunger strikes or work stoppages, attempting to maintain collective resistance. Most insidiously, they enforced a culture of performative loyalty. Prisoners were required to participate in daily rituals, standing at attention during prescribed times to face east toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, reciting loyalty oaths, maintaining absolute silence about any doubts regarding imperial ideology. Those who refused or who showed insufficient enthusiasm were marked as traitors. American camp commanders were well aware of this internal conflict. Intelligence reports identified the leaders of resistance cells and tracked their activities. But the response was calculated and restrained. Heavy-handed suppression would play into the hardcore narrative that Americans were indeed barbaric oppressors. Instead, camp administrators used a combination of segregation and continued abundance. The most fanatical prisoners were gradually moved to separate facilities or separate barracks within camps, reducing their ability to intimidate the broader population. Meanwhile, the material conditions and programs designed to demonstrate American values continued unabated. By December 1944, this tension within the camps was reaching a breaking point. Christmas was approaching, and American camp administrators planned an even more elaborate celebration than Thanksgiving, a full-scale cultural demonstration designed to accelerate the psychological transformation of the prisoners. The Christmas preparations began weeks in advance. Camp administrators procured Christmas trees, real evergreen trees, decorated with lights, tinsel, and ornaments. They arranged for special meal provisions that exceeded even the Thanksgiving feast: roasted ham and turkey, multiple side dishes, elaborate desserts including ice cream, candies, and fruitcakes. They organized entertainment. American soldiers would perform Christmas carols, and prisoners would be invited to share their own musical traditions. The camp canteen stocked special Christmas items: cigarettes, chocolates, toiletries packaged as gifts. The hardcore resistance leaders recognized this for what it was: an escalation of the psychological campaign. They issued warnings through their secret communication networks. Any prisoner who participated enthusiastically in Christmas celebrations would be marked as a collaborator. Some threatened that names would be recorded and reported to Japanese authorities after the war, resulting in punishment for the prisoners and their families. But the American strategy had a crucial advantage. The hardcore prisoners were fighting against human nature itself. You can maintain ideological purity in the face of abstract arguments. It's far harder to maintain it in the face of abundance, kindness, and the fundamental human need for connection and hope. Christmas Day, 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The mess hall is transformed. Christmas trees stand in corners, their lights reflecting off walls decorated with paper chains and cut-out snowflakes made by prisoners in craft workshops. The air is thick with the aroma of roasting meat and fresh-baked bread. Long tables are set with more care than usual. Real tablecloths, place settings that include multiple utensils. American guards and administrators have dressed in their best uniforms. Some have brought their families, wives and children, to join in the celebration, a powerful gesture that silently communicates trust and humanity. The prisoners file in, their reactions ranging from eager anticipation to sullen resistance. The hardcore prisoners maintain rigid discipline, their faces masks of contempt. But many others, perhaps the majority now, show tentative hope, curiosity, even excitement. Over the past month, since Thanksgiving, something has shifted in the camp's atmosphere. More prisoners are attending classes, participating in work details, engaging with Nisei interpreters in actual conversation rather than hostile silence. The meal is served, and once again, the sheer abundance is overwhelming. But this time, something additional happens, something that no amount of strategic planning could have fully orchestrated. Among the Japanese prisoners are a small number of Christians. Christianity had been present in Japan since the 16th century, though it remained a minority faith, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted. These Christian prisoners had maintained their faith secretly during military service, and in the camps they had begun to practice openly. The American chaplains, as part of the policy of cultural respect, had provided them with Japanese-language Bibles and had allowed them to hold services. On this Christmas Day, as the meal concludes and American soldiers begin singing English Christmas carols, "O Holy Night, hark the herald angels sing," something unexpected happens. A group of Japanese Christian prisoners stands and begins singing Silent Night in Japanese, Kiyoshi Kono Yoru. The effect is electric. The English and Japanese versions of the carol interweave, creating a spontaneous bilingual harmony. American guards and administrators, many of whom had fought in the Pacific and had lost friends to Japanese forces, stand in stunned silence. Some weep openly. The Japanese prisoners, Christian and non-Christian alike, are transfixed. Even some of the hardcore resistance members show cracks in their rigid facades, their eyes glistening with suppressed emotion. In that moment, something transcends the calculated psychological operation. This isn't propaganda. This isn't strategic manipulation. This is a genuine moment of shared humanity. Enemy soldiers and their former captors united in a recognition of common spiritual heritage and common longing for peace. The Christian prisoners singing in Japanese, the American soldiers joining in English, the non-Christian prisoners listening in silence but clearly moved. All of it creates an emotional resonance that no amount of planning could manufacture. Nisei interpreter reports from that evening capture statements from prisoners that reveal the profound impact. One prisoner said, "When I heard our language singing the same song as the Americans, I realized we are not so different. We have been taught we are superior, or they are superior, but in this moment, we were the same." Another, "I have been holding anger in my heart, but tonight I feel it leaving. I do not know if I can be loyal to the emperor anymore. I do not know what I believe, but I know that hatred is no longer enough." Even some hardcore resistance members were shaken. Not all, some maintained their rigid loyalty, but reports indicate that several known resistance leaders were seen wiping tears during the singing, and in subsequent weeks, a few of these men quietly withdrew from resistance activities, no longer willing to punish prisoners for accepting what they themselves had felt, a moment of genuine human connection. The Christmas celebration of 1944 marked a turning point in the American POW psychological warfare campaign. It demonstrated that abundance and kindness, combined with respect for cultural identity and genuine human interaction, could achieve what coercion and indoctrination never could, a voluntary transformation of worldview. The prisoners weren't being forced to renounce their beliefs. They were being given lived experiences that made those beliefs impossible to maintain. But the question remained, what would happen when these men returned to Japan? Would this transformation last, or would it collapse under the pressure of returning to a society still dominated by militarist ideology? The answer would shape the future of an entire nation. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast via radio for the first time in Japanese history, announces Japan's surrender. For the prisoners in American POW camps, the news arrives with complex emotions. Relief that the war is over. Uncertainty about what comes next. For many, a deep anxiety. What will await them when they return home? The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Tens of thousands of Japanese POWs, held in camps across the United States and Pacific territories, were processed and returned to Japan. For men like our composite figure, Private Tanaka, the journey home was surreal, a return to a homeland that existed now only in memory and imagination. The Japan they returned to bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. American firebombing and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had devastated urban centers. The industrial capacity that had supported the war effort lay in ruins. Food production had collapsed. Starvation was rampant. In the winter of 1945-46, millions of Japanese civilians survived on rations that provided fewer than 1,000 calories per day, less than half the minimum needed for survival. The black market flourished as families sold heirlooms and possessions for handfuls of rice. Into this landscape of ruin and starvation came the returning POWs. They brought with them no material wealth. They had been prisoners. But they carried something more valuable and more dangerous to the remnants of the militarist establishment. They carried knowledge. They had seen, with their own eyes, the reality of American power and abundance. They knew, in their bodies and bones, that everything they had been taught about Western weakness and Japanese superiority was a lie. The reception they received was often hostile. In a society still clinging to militarist values and searching for scapegoats to explain catastrophic defeat, former POWs were marked by shame. They had surrendered, the ultimate dishonor in the ideology of Imperial Japan. Some families initially refused to acknowledge their returned sons and husbands. Some communities ostracized them. Job opportunities were limited. The men who had been transformed by American abundance found themselves back in a society that viewed them with suspicion and contempt. Yet this very marginalization gave them a strange freedom. Having already been branded as dishonorable, they had little left to lose by speaking uncomfortable truths. In conversations with family, with former military comrades, with neighbors, the former POWs began sharing their experiences. They described the food they had received in American camps. Food that exceeded what they now received as free citizens in their own country. They described the medical care, the education, the respect for cultural practices, the wages paid for work. They described Christmas celebrations where former enemies sang together and wept together. These stories spread through a society desperate for explanations and hungry for hope. Why had Japan lost? The official narrative, that Japan had been overwhelmed by material superiority but remained spiritually superior, began to crack under the weight of testimony from men who had lived among the Americans. They reported that Americans were not weak or decadent but strong, confident, and wealthy beyond Japanese imagination. They reported that democracy did not lead to chaos, but to prosperity. They reported that individual rights did not weaken a nation but strengthened it. This grassroots knowledge campaign, carried out by former POWs who had become unwitting ambassadors of American values, coincided with the U.S. occupation of Japan under General Douglas MacArthur. The occupation authorities pursued aggressive reforms, dismantling the militarist government structure, establishing democratic institutions, promoting labor rights, pursuing land reform, and encouraging free speech and free press. In normal circumstances, such radical changes imposed by a foreign occupying power might have met fierce resistance. Japanese culture values social harmony and consensus. Revolutionary change imposed from outside could have been seen as humiliation and sparked nationalist backlash. But the ground had been prepared. The former POWs, numbering in the tens of thousands and dispersed throughout Japanese society, served as living proof that the American model was not merely propaganda but lived reality. When occupation authorities claimed that democracy could work in Japan, former POWs could confirm, "We have seen democracy function." When occupation authorities promoted free market economics, former POWs could confirm, "We have seen abundance that our system could never provide." When occupation authorities argued that individual rights were compatible with Japanese culture, former POWs could confirm, "We maintained our Japanese identity while experiencing freedom." This dynamic was particularly important in rural areas where the occupation's reach was limited and where traditional values remained strongest. In small towns and farming villages, the testimony of a local son who had returned from an American POW camp carried weight that no amount of official propaganda could match. These men weren't American agents or collaborators. They were neighbors, family members, people known and trusted within their communities. When they spoke about their experiences, people listened. Historical research on Japan's post-war transformation has identified multiple factors contributing to its rapid democratization and economic recovery. The occupation reforms, the devastation that discredited militarism, the emperor's role in endorsing peace, the Marshall Plan-style economic assistance, and the Cold War context that made Japan a crucial American ally. But among these factors, often overlooked, is the role of former POWs as grassroots advocates for democratic transformation. These men did not organize political movements or found advocacy groups. Most simply returned to civilian life, found work, married, raised families. But in countless small interactions, conversations at work, discussions with neighbors, explanations to younger Japanese who wanted to understand what had happened, they conveyed a message that undermined the foundations of militarist ideology. The message was simple: we were lied to. The Americans are not devils. Democracy is not weakness. There is another way. By the 1950s, as Japan entered a period of rapid economic growth that would become known as the Japanese economic miracle, the transformation was complete. Japan had become a stable democracy and an American ally. The society that had produced kamikaze pilots and fanatical resistance now embraced pacifist constitutional provisions and rejected militarism. Multiple factors contributed to this transformation, but the psychological warfare branch's operation in American POW camps played an underappreciated role. The investment in treating Japanese prisoners with abundance and respect paid dividends far beyond the immediate goals of preventing camp uprisings. It created a cohort of Japanese citizens who had experienced an alternative reality and who could serve as witnesses to that reality within Japanese society. The cruel irony is that these men, who had helped transform their nation, often received little recognition for their role. Many carried the stigma of former POWs throughout their lives. Some never spoke publicly about their experiences, the shame too deep despite the passage of time. The Japanese government, focused on moving forward and rebuilding national pride, had little interest in celebrating the stories of men who had surrendered and been re-educated by the enemy. Yet in private moments, conversations with children and grandchildren, recorded oral histories preserved in archives, memoirs written late in life, many former POWs reflected on their experiences with remarkable insight. They understood, in ways that historians and strategists would only later articulate, what had happened to them in those camps. They had been targets of psychological warfare. They had been manipulated, their ideological foundations deliberately undermined through calculated demonstrations of abundance and kindness. But they also recognized something more complex. Within that manipulation was genuine humanity. The American soldiers who served them Thanksgiving dinner, the Nisei interpreters who spoke with them in their own language, the chaplains who provided religious texts, the doctors who treated their wounds. These people were not merely following orders or executing a strategic plan. They were also expressing authentic compassion and respect. The operation was both weapon and olive branch, both strategic manipulation and genuine kindness. This duality, the weaponization of compassion, remains one of the most philosophically complex aspects of the Pacific War. War, we typically assume, is prosecuted through violence, destruction, the breaking of the enemies will through force. The American strategy in POW camps represented something different. The breaking of the enemies will through abundance, education, and respect. It was psychological warfare, yes, but psychological warfare that created lasting positive change rather than trauma and bitterness. The operation also revealed profound truths about ideology and belief. The militarist indoctrination of Japanese soldiers was intense, comprehensive, and reinforced through years of conditioning. Yet it proved surprisingly fragile when confronted with contradictory lived experience. Ideas, no matter how deeply embedded, struggle to survive contact with undeniable reality. You can teach a man that the enemy is a barbaric devil, but if that enemy then treats him with consistent kindness and abundance, the ideology collapses. You can teach a man that his own system is superior and righteous, but if that system left him starving while the enemy's system feeds him bountifully, the comparison is inescapable. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Throughout history and continuing today, ideological conflicts between political systems, religious traditions, economic models are fought primarily through rhetoric and force. The American POW strategy suggests an alternative approach. Demonstrate the superiority of your system not through argumentation, but through lived experience. Let people see, touch, taste, and experience the reality of your values. Material abundance, when combined with genuine respect for human dignity, becomes an argument more powerful than any propaganda. Of course, this approach requires actually having superior material conditions to demonstrate, a luxury not available to all systems in all conflicts. The United States in 1944 possessed industrial and agricultural capacity that could support both total war and the lavish treatment of enemy prisoners. Not every nation, in every conflict, enjoys such abundance. The strategy also requires a genuine belief in the superiority and universal appeal of one's own values. American commanders believed, with justification, despite America's profound domestic flaws, including racial segregation and the unjust internment of Japanese Americans, that democratic principles and material prosperity would appeal to Japanese prisoners if genuinely demonstrated. That confidence enabled the psychological operation. But perhaps the deepest lesson is this: people are not permanently locked into any ideology, no matter how intensive the indoctrination. Human beings are capable of change, of reconsidering fundamental beliefs, of accepting new frameworks for understanding the world. The Japanese soldiers who wept during Christmas carols, who began attending education classes, who questioned the militarist ideology they had once accepted without doubt. These men were not weak or disloyal. They were responding rationally to new evidence and new experiences. The capacity for ideological transformation, for growth beyond the limitations of one's conditioning, is a fundamental human characteristic. The former POWs who returned to Japan and became unwitting ambassadors for democratic transformation exercised this capacity. They had been raised in a militarist society, trained to die for the emperor, conditioned to view surrender as ultimate dishonor. Yet when confronted with undeniable evidence that contradicted their conditioning, abundant food, medical care, respect, kindness from those they'd been taught were devils, they were capable of changing. And in changing themselves, they helped change their entire society. By the 1960s and 1970s, as Japan's economic miracle reached its peak, a new generation of Japanese came of age with no memory of the war. They knew Japan as a prosperous democracy, an American ally, a pacifist nation committed to economic rather than military power. The militarism of the 1930s and 1940s seemed like ancient history, a dark period best forgotten. Few of these young Japanese knew the stories of the POW camps, the Thanksgiving feasts, the Christmas carols sung in Japanese and English. The operation had been so successful that it became invisible. The transformed ideology now seemed natural, inevitable, the only possible way for Japanese society to function. The former POWs aged into elderly men, carrying with them memories of the strangest chapter in their lives. The time they were enemies who were fed like kings, prisoners who were treated with dignity, soldiers who learned that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Some took those memories to their graves without ever fully reconciling the contradictions. Others found peace in understanding that they had been part of something larger, an experiment in whether compassion could be weaponized, whether abundance could defeat ideology, whether former enemies could become friends not through forgetting but through transformation. The historical record is clear. The American psychological warfare operation in POW camps holding Japanese prisoners was a calculated, strategic program designed to undermine enemy ideology and create a cohort of re-educated individuals who could facilitate post-war transformation. It succeeded beyond the wildest expectations of its architects. The investment in treating prisoners with extraordinary abundance and respect paid dividends in preventing camp uprisings, in facilitating occupation reforms, and in supporting Japan's rapid democratization. But the historical record also reveals something the strategic planners perhaps didn't fully anticipate. That genuine human connection, once created, transcends its original purpose. The American guards and administrators who worked in those camps, who served holiday feasts and organized education programs, many of them formed real relationships with the prisoners. The Nisei interpreters, serving as bridges between two cultures while their own families sat in internment camps, found complicated kinship with prisoners who initially despised them. The prisoners themselves, despite being targets of psychological manipulation, experienced genuine kindness that left lasting impressions. War creates categories: friend and enemy, us and them, victor and vanquished. The genius and the moral complexity of Operation Kindness. Though it was never officially called that, the term used here is merely descriptive, was that it used the tools of war to blur those categories, to create a space where enemy soldiers could be seen as human beings capable of change, where ideological transformation could be pursued through abundance rather than deprivation, where psychological warfare could create not just defeat, but the possibility of genuine reconciliation. The operation was not without its ethical complications. It was manipulation. It was designed to break down the prisoner's existing worldview and replace it with one more amenable to American interests. The kindness was strategic, the abundance was weaponized, the respect was calculated to achieve specific outcomes. Some might argue this makes the entire operation a form of sophisticated brainwashing, no more ethical than the Japanese militarist indoctrination it sought to counteract. Yet the outcomes speak for themselves. The Japanese soldiers who returned home did not become broken men, traumatized by re-education. They became citizens of a transformed Japan, a peaceful, prosperous democracy that has now maintained civilian government and pacifist principles for over 75 years. The psychological warfare operation, for all its manipulation, created conditions for positive transformation rather than lasting trauma. It opened possibilities rather than closing them. It demonstrated that enemies could become allies, that ideological divides could be bridged, that the cycle of hatred and violence could be interrupted. In the decades since World War II, the lessons of the POWs psychological warfare operation have been studied, debated, and occasionally applied in various contexts. Military strategists recognize that winning wars requires not just defeating enemy forces, but transforming enemy populations' understanding of their own interests. Human rights advocates recognize that even in circumstances of conflict and captivity, treatment with dignity and respect serves long-term interests. Historians recognize that some of the most important battles are fought not on physical terrain, but in the realm of ideas, beliefs, and worldviews. The story of Operation Kindness, of Thanksgiving feasts in Wisconsin, of Christmas carols sung in Japanese, of prisoners weeping at abundance, of hardened militarists questioning their own ideology, remains one of the most remarkable and least known chapters of World War II. It deserves to be remembered not as a curiosity or footnote, but as a central example of how wars are truly won, not just through superior firepower, but through superior ideas, demonstrated not through propaganda, but through lived experience. The men who experienced this operation, American commanders who designed it, Nisei interpreters who implemented it, guards who served the meals, prisoners who ate them, are nearly all gone now. But the legacy remains, embedded in the democratic institutions of modern Japan, in the alliance between former enemies, in the proof that even the deepest ideological divides can be bridged when met with genuine abundance, respect, and the recognition of shared humanity. The question that remains, the question that should provoke thought and discussion, is this: was it ethical? The United States used kindness as a psychological weapon. It treated enemy prisoners with extraordinary abundance and respect, treatment that exceeded legal requirements and that most American citizens would have found shockingly generous given the brutal nature of the Pacific War. But this kindness was not purely altruistic. It was calculated. It was designed to achieve strategic objectives, preventing uprisings, gathering intelligence, and creating a cohort of ideologically transformed individuals who could facilitate post-war occupation and reconstruction. Does the strategic motive taint the humanitarian treatment? If kindness is weaponized, is it still kindness? If abundance is used as a tool of psychological manipulation, does that make it exploitation? Or is it possible for an action to be both strategically calculated and genuinely humane, both a weapon and an act of compassion? Consider the alternative. The United States could have treated Japanese POWs with harsh discipline, minimal rations, and punitive measures, all while technically complying with Geneva Convention requirements. Many Americans, grieving sons lost in the Pacific, might have supported such treatment. It would have been emotionally satisfying and arguably justified given the documented atrocities committed by Japanese forces. Yet such treatment would have reinforced Japanese propaganda about American barbarism, made post-war reconciliation far more difficult, and potentially created a generation of embittered former POWs who would resist democratic transformation. The choice to treat prisoners with abundance and respect, even when calculated for strategic advantage, created better outcomes for everyone involved. The prisoners lived, received medical care, were fed, and gained knowledge that transformed their worldview. American guards and administrators discovered that former enemies could become people worthy of respect. Post-war Japan benefited from having a cohort of citizens who could testify to the reality of democratic values. The strategic calculation aligned with humanitarian values, perhaps the rarest and most valuable alignment in warfare. The U.S. used kindness as a psychological weapon. Was this an act of genuine humanity, or a deeply cynical form of manipulation? I'm genuinely curious to read your reasoned arguments in the comments. These hidden stories prove that history is more complex and fascinating than we're ever taught. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe and join our mission to uncover the truth. We have another incredible story coming next week that you won't want to miss.